there, and welcome back for our next lesson in APUS history. Today we're talking about topic 4.5, which is the first of two lessons on the market revolution. Today we're talking about industrialization. So our goal is to explain the causes and effects of the innovations in technology, agriculture, and commerce over time. So I do think the title of the lesson is a little misleading. It says industrialization, but really we're talking about changes to agriculture as well. So we're first going to be making sure that we include how the relationships between production and commerce change, how the manufacture of goods becomes more organized. We're going to reference some innovations and inventions. We're going to talk about how the federal government supported this thing called the market revolution. And we are also going to include some information about how cotton production connected to the growth of the northern economy. And so today we're starting with historical context, talking about various aspects of the market revolution, referencing judiciary decisions and legislative acts, and then culminating by looking at the impact. So there's quite a few things here related to the historical context that help you to understand the market revolution more closely. So understanding that in this time period, it is often called the era of good feelings, that there was just this spirit of nationalism, this connection. We think about the political elections at the time, how there was really only one major political party. Henry Clay's American system is extremely related to the growth of industry. His ideas related to tariffs, the national bank, and internal improvements come to fruition. Population growth, we are seeing expansive growth, not only in the number of the people, but also in where they live. So we're seeing in this period a huge expansion westward past the Mississippi River. Couple other things to note is that especially before the American Revolution, America would have been considered more of a barter economy. And so this is going to be the trading of goods and services rather than using money for transactions. But by the time we get to our 1820s, that has shifted. Another thing to note is that there's a big shift in the way that goods are manufactured. And prior to the factory system, there was something called the putting out system, in which merchants would actually take raw materials to individuals' homes or to small businesses, and artisans and family members would then process the raw materials into a good. And so that system will be replaced by the factory system. So what we're going to talk about next is the transportation revolution. So this is one component of our market revolution. So what we're really talking about is that there is a change in where goods are produced, how they are transported, and how they are bought and sold. So all of those ideas comprise our market revolution. So one major component is the transportation revolution. And so by changing the infrastructure, the United States is able to create a more efficient network, which allows for the movement of people, raw materials, and manufactured goods, which is essential in a growing economy. So one area that we see really growing is roads. Now, while Henry Clay is going to support the idea of federally backed or federally paid for national roads, that there's really only one major exception here in this time period. That's going to be called the National or Cumberland Road. It is massive, and it was a big ordeal starting around 1811 and taking up until the 1850s to finish production. But for the most part, we see privately built or state-funded roads being developed, and states' writers blocking federal spending up until closer to John Quincy Adams' presidency. Another really significant component to the transportation revolution is going to be canal building. And the largest one that students usually are familiar with is the Erie Canal. So this was also called Clinton's Ditch, after the governor of New York had decided this was a project he was going to support. Everyone thought it wouldn't work, as it was 363 miles long and had a change in elevation of 565 feet. They just weren't sure how this would work. But by the time it was formed and completed in the 1830s, this canal carried more than 2 times the freight of the Mississippi River. So this this led to this spurred on many other states completing canals and even the federal government supporting canal building as well. So what ends up happening is now the production of goods in the West, especially farm crops, are able to be shipped a lot more easily and cheaply. And so, for example, the cost of shipping a ton of goods changed from $100 to $9, and in some cases, even $3. So obviously, that's going to stimulate economic growth and encourage further canal building. Here you can see are a variety of other canals that were built in this time period. So looking at two more aspects of the transportation revolution would be the actual vehicles on which goods were carried. So one is going to be the steamboat. The first successful steamboat passage will happen in 1807 with the Clermont, and it allowed for goods to go upriver as well. So what would happen prior to this is that if someone, say in Illinois, wanted to send their goods to New Orleans, they would build a raft or some sort to carry their goods down. They would travel down the river, and then they would actually dismantle their raft, sell it, and then either walk or ride by horse back north. So very time consuming. What ends up happening is time will be cut so significantly because goods and people can be transported back up the river that it further increases the use of the Mississippi River as a major transportation hub. Railroads are also significant. These begin a bit later in the 1820s, and this is going to really fuel migration to Western towns, and it is going to create rapid and reliable links, especially as schedules for trains become developed. And then those cities will be able to increase their population, and the amount of goods being sold there will lead to an economic boom. So here is a famous painting called The Iron Horse Wins, showing a race between a horse and the iron horse, or the train. Here you can see are the roads, canals, and railroads that were built during this time period. You can also take a look at this graph where you can see period 4 is only going to pay attention to the columns related to 1800 and 1830, but you can see as the transportation revolution continues on, especially towards our Civil War, we see those times between New York and various other places in the country decreasing significantly. Here you can see the effect of the transportation revolution and other things on the growth of cities. So we see our population booming between 1820 and 1860, but you also can notice that several towns in the West grew significantly that either weren't on the map at all or were very small in 1820. So let's just quickly look at a few inventions and innovations of the time period. These stimulated efficient and productive changes in 4 major areas: agriculture, communication, transportation, and production. So what you're seeing in these images are the spinning jenny, which really changed the way that cloth was produced. We've got the cotton gin, which we will reference in other lessons as well, which completely transformed the way that cotton was cleaned and led to a cotton boom in the South and the increase in slavery. We also see the mechanical reaper, which changed agriculture significantly in the West, and then the Clermont, that steamboat. But then there you can see on the left are significant other inventions. This is not a complete list, especially when you think about in 1800, there were 306 patents, and in 1860, 28,000. So there's just numerous inventions. It would be helpful for you to know a few, especially thinking about how they relate to our 4 big categories: agriculture, communication, transportation, and production. Okay, so we're going to shift here to another aspect of the market revolution, which is the growth of industry. So one major factor why manufacturing is going to surpass agriculture in value by the mid-1800s is going to be because of the development of corporations. And so states are going to pass laws that allow for easier incorporation of businesses, and also the ability to raise capital for business by selling shares of stock. We see the New York Stock Exchange actually being created in this time period. And what this does is it allows for capital to be raised, which then allows for those companies to build things like factories, canals, and railroads, which then improve business and industry as a whole. We also see, as I mentioned earlier, the development of the factory system as opposed to the putting out system. And this really began because of a man, an immigrant named Samuel Slater, who had basically taken kind of some British secrets on the factory system, and he had memorized the way that the system was implemented in Britain. He migrated to the United States and began implementing those ideas in New England. Also, because of the Embargo Act and the War of 1812 and then protective tariffs, all of those things stimulated domestic manufacturing. It was harder and more costly to get goods from Europe. And so it furthered the demand for American goods which benefited manufacturers, especially in New England. New England is where most of the manufacturing is going to center, and that is in large part because of the water power and seaports, but also it's because agriculture just wasn't as profitable in that area. What this did was, because there were so many factories and because factories are so costly upfront to build, it led to a need for more financial businesses related to banking and insurance especially. And so we see the financial sector of this region growing. Here you can see the number of spindles in operation in 1840. And as you can see, there are significantly more in the New England area. Now, that's not to say there was no textile factories in the South or in the West. They just weren't as, it just wasn't as much there. One of the more famous mills at the start is going to be the Lowell Mills, located in Massachusetts. And if you spent some time looking at this, you would notice that the mills are located near water sources and that there were actually boarding houses. And this is where the especially young women would live as they worked in the Lowell Mills. We're going to talk about the impact of the market revolution on women more in our next lesson. So we'll come back to this idea of the Lowell Mills then. So continuing on, as I just mentioned, the growth of labor is really important for the growth of industry. And so textile mills will recruit young farm women. And they also rely extensively on child labor. But then as we move towards the middle of the 1800s, we see more immigrants coming and partaking in this industry as well. We see early unions forming. Unions will be a major part of American history, but we tend to think of it more in the later 1800s. But we do see those early unions trying to obtain better conditions for workers. But because there was such high immigration at this time, because laws prevented unions from developing and frequent economic depressions just didn't make strikes really possible, the unions didn't gain much traction during these early years of the 1800s. Okay, last aspect that we're going to talk about here for the market revolution is going to be the development of commercial agriculture. So this is where we're shifting from subsistence agriculture, which is growing enough for your family or to trade locally, to commercial, which is growing significant amounts to be sold to other markets. So cheap land in the West. The federal government is going to make land available in the West very cheap, and that is going to encourage migration to the West. Easy credit is also essential. Farmers will be able to purchase land and starting materials for low interest rates, which also encourages them that they can make this move to the West. And then the development that happened through the transportation revolution will allow farmers to know that when they do produce their crop, they will be able to transport it and sell it and make a profit. So where we really see the commercial agriculture changing is in the South. And again, we're going to talk about this in particular much more in depth in a future lesson in Unit 4. But we do want to recognize that in the 1800s, in the early 1800s, we are seeing the growth of cotton. And one major reason for this is because of the cotton gin, the invention of this machine that makes growing cotton and cleaning it significantly easier. It means that that means that cotton has become more profitable than tobacco and indigo. And so enslavers will then use their profits to then purchase more slaves and more land. And at this time, the majority of cotton will be shipped to Britain. So what we see happening is the federal government really supporting a lot of these ideas related to the market revolution. We're just going to look briefly at two court cases that were already referenced earlier in this unit, but quickly relating them to the market revolution. So McCulloch versus Maryland is when Maryland attempted to tax the Second Bank of the United States. Now, Chief Justice John Marshall leans to a federalist slant point of view, larger federal government. And so he cites the supremacy clause when he states that the federal government's laws are supreme to the states and that a state cannot tax a federal institution. What he also does is that he references the idea of implied powers and that the bank is constitutional. And so while this had been a long-standing debate, he does settle this debate, and the National Bank does continue on. Gibbons versus Ogden is another essential court case in which Chief Justice John Marshall and the Supreme Court declare that New York doesn't have the power to give this person, Ogden, a monopoly on ferry service. Because New York Harbor accesses other areas, not just New York, it is not up to New York to govern that trade. And so it reinforces the federal control over interstate commerce, which was an essential part of the growing industry. Additionally, legislative acts related to the American system, for example, several tariffs, which we'll talk about again, these are going to be protective in nature, in which they're trying to encourage more manufacturing in the New England area. We see federal funding for infrastructure. Two examples would be the National Road and the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal. And then, as I already mentioned, the Second Bank of the United States, existing from 1816 to 1836. So what is the impact of the market revolution? We see regional specialization. The East becomes industrial. The West is known as the nation's breadbasket, growing many grains, feeding workers in other parts of the country and the world. We see the South becoming really recognized as an area of cotton and with slavery. Now, because regions are specializing, we see interdependence growing, where regions depend on each other for survival. So, for example, Western farmers grow the grains to feed the New England workers. The New England workers are manufacturing goods needed by the Western farmers, and Southern enslaved persons are harvesting cotton for the New England textile mills. So they all are connected, and that transportation revolution allows for that to happen. Another really good example would be New York City, where we probably see the best example of how all of these regions come together. So New York businesses would purchase cotton from southern ports, and they would transport them on small ships to New York, where then they would transfer the materials to larger ships to Europe. Now, why would the South do this? Why wouldn't the South just send the goods directly to Europe? Well, the port was more easily accessible in New York City for the larger ships. They already had a strong shipping infrastructure. They had experienced dock workers, and New York developed a fixed shipping schedule that was dependable, and many businesses supported and liked knowing that reliable schedule. Additionally, New York would then obtain manufactured goods from Europe to be sold in the U.S. And while New England didn't appreciate that, the rest of the country appreciated those cheaper goods. Banks and businesses financed and insured commercial endeavors in the West and Northeast. And so people would take out loans from many of the businesses and banks in New York to pay for land and build factories. And then also the emergence of the New York Stock Exchange will be essential for the growth of the overall economy. So that's how New York can be a really good example of how this whole idea of the market revolution comes together with both regional specialization and interdependence of the areas. So we're going to end here with a quote from a book called The Market Revolution in America. And it says, "What do we mean by a market revolution in America? At the end of its war for independence, the United States comprised 13 separate provinces on the coast of North America. Nearly all of 3.9 million people made their living through agriculture, while a small merchant class traded tobacco, timber, and foodstuffs, flour, rice, livestock, salted meat, and fish, for tropical goods, useful manufactures, and luxuries in the Atlantic commercial community. By the end of the Civil War, 8 decades later, the United States sprawled across the North American continent. Nearly 32 million people labored not just on farms, but in shops and factories making iron and steel products, boots and shoes, textiles, paper, packaged foodstuff, firearms, farm machinery, furniture, tools, and all sorts of housewares. Civil War era Americans borrowed money from banks, bought insurance against fire, theft, shipwreck, commercial losses, and even premature death, traveled on steamboats and in railway carriages, and produced $2 to $3 billion worth of goods and services, including exports of $4 million. This dramatic transformation is what some historians of the United States call the market revolution. So hopefully this excerpt just kind of culminated everything we talked about, in that really this period between 1800 and 1840 to 1860, we see rapid and significant changes in the US, especially in our economy. So I hope this lesson was helpful for you in understanding the market revolution. And if so, please like and subscribe.